That's why people like David Icke are jewels and gems to this world. David, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure, but I mean, I can't do anything else, because once you start to understand what's happening in the world, and that started to come to me a long time ago now, 30 years, and you realize where the world is being taken, then walking away and staying silent is not an option if you have any self-respect. And that's what it comes down to in the end, self-respect. Are we going to speak our truth and have the self-respect to do that, or are we going to self-censor and silence ourselves and keep our heads down for fear of consequences? And, you know, that's an important point. It all comes down to that in the end, in terms of self-censorship. Consequences. Consequences are prisons. They're prison cells. Because when I wrote The Trigger, I knew that I was going to deeply, deeply upset what I expose, which is a death cult. And we can get into that as we go through today. And that death cult has control of the mainstream media, and thus could demonize me and could attempt to shut me down. You know, a few days after publication, suddenly Facebook, which is controlled by this death cult, like Silicon Valley in general, threatening to delete my page. I mean, that's just a coincidence, isn't it? But if you sit down and you say, what are the consequences for me of doing what I know to be right and saying what I know to be right, then invariably fear of the consequences will persuade you it's better not to do it, not to say it, not to write it. But I don't go through that mental process of asking what are the consequences. What I ask is it true? Can I justify it with the facts? My goodness me, the figure is brimming over with facts on every page to support what I'm saying. And if the answer to that is yes, then it's going out there. The consequences will take care of themselves. And you know, the whole foundation of human control is based on intimidation. Put in words of one syllable, it's getting people to give a shit about what people think of them, the consequences that might happen to them. And once you can get people in that mode, then they'll start self-censoring. Once you decide that consequences and abuse are of no importance to you, doing what you know to be right is the only thing that drives you, then what you're doing is you're taking your power back from that which you're exposing, because the currency of control is intimidation, fear of consequences. So they're the first things that have to go if we really mean it when we say we want to make a difference. And when you put aside fear of consequences and just do what you know to be right, then that control system has lost its power over you. It's lost its power over silencing you, because you won't be silenced, because why would you compromise saying what you know to be right, except out of fear? And I gave that up a long time ago. And this is very important, that people put consequences aside and do what they know to be right. And it's like everything. You know, when I was a footballer, I was a goalkeeper, a professional goalkeeper. And the worst part, this is a long time ago, I finished when I was 21. The worst part of playing football as a professional was sitting in the dressing room waiting to go out to play. Because everything that could possibly go wrong was going wrong in your head. I better not do this. I hope that doesn't happen. And then you got on the pitch where you actually did it, and it was fine. And 99% of the time, what you were stressing about in the dressing room, I hope this doesn't happen, what if that happens, didn't happen. And, you know, I can tell you that after 30 years of taking abuse for doing and saying what I believe to be right, I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm stronger than ever. I've got more people looking at what I'm saying than ever. And if you keep walking and you don't stop, you don't surrender your right to your own truth, then instead of you trotting after the world starts moving in your direction, if what you say has validity, that is. But if you hadn't said it in the first place through fear of the consequences, then you wouldn't be proved right down the road. And as a result of that, more people come and say, well, what else is this guy saying then? So this is the bottom line. You want to make a difference? Okay, put consequences aside and speak your truth. And you'll find it's not as difficult as you thought it was.
Oh, man. Well done. Thank you so much, David. Oh, God, that resonates so much with me. As you know, I've been doing this work for quite some time. Different to you, I know. But, you know, and I just thought that, you know, I feel that most people, even if they're not doing the sort of work that I'm doing and, you know, the kind of bigger work that you're doing, I think we die inside if we don't speak the truth when we see something that's so unjust and so terrible, you know. I mean, I would rather die I'd rather take a bullet in the head than not do the work I'm doing. And I'm not seeing my family enough. I'm not giving myself enough time. I'm not, you know, and the crux of it is, for me, is that I see the whole of humanity like my family. And I'm not saying that to be a martyr, David. I feel there's people who haven't been born yet who are my personal spiritual family. And they're relying on me now, and you and all the other people who are trying to alert people to what is happening and what has happened and what, more importantly, is going to happen to humanity if we fail to look at the truth. Dr. Graham Downing, he's been very helpful me to a lovely man. He was just speaking to him before we came on, and he was saying 9/11's cleared the way. You know, it's terrified everybody, you know, so that it can do its thing, you know. And, you know, David, it's just amazing what's going on. And I just don't know where to start with you, honestly. It's just a very exciting time. But I believe that the net is coming around humanity, shutting everyone up. And like I said about Julian Assange, they've cut his tongue out. And it's like a warning. Anyone else will have their tongues cut out. And that is, for me, more of a thing. I was thinking of my dad earlier on, David. You know, I love him so much. He's gone now. And I used to try and tell him what was going on. We used to have little conversations about the government and how terrible it was and blah, blah, blah. He knew. But he said, Jason, you sound like a Jehovah's Witness. Now, I go down the beach every day and I sit there and I've got a beautiful life. I don't want to know it. And I'm not using my dad as a horrible example. That is where a lot of people are, David. They cannot face the bitter pill that they've been tricked all their lives. They would rather just look the other way, and they'd rather just carry on being abused. Literally, it's a sadistic, masochistic symbiosis between humanity and the controllers. And I don't know where you want to start, David. I just don't know. But it'd be a good place to start, really, about who did it. Because I noticed when you did your trigger talk in Derby, you said people were saying, who did it, you know? And the Sabbatean Frankist control thing, only once we understand all that and the multifaceted nuances of the spider's web. And I thought I know quite a lot about this stuff, David, but I got to tell everyone, I'm the dunce of the universe when it comes to that. I'm really disappointed. I look at David's work and it's like, wow, how does this man retain all this information? It's a lifetime work. It's a lifetime achievement award. I'd give him the Nobel Peace Prize next. I really mean it. And I'm not just saying that. It's the truth. And there's no...
I'd hand it back. Yeah. That's the most tainted award in the history of the world, that is.
I bet you wouldn't go down on what... Would you go down in one knee in front of the Queen? No, you would not, David.
I don't think so.
Right. Where do you want to start, David? What can we tell people?
Well, first of all, the book, The Trigger, is written in two parts. It's really two books within two covers. And the first part takes apart the official story of 9/11. And, of course, I've been on this case since the day it happened, because when I saw what had happened actually on 9/11, It so fitted a technique that I've been talking about, and I dubbed it back in the 90s, problem, reaction, solution. Create the problem, get the reaction, do something, and then offer the solution to the problems you've created, which are changes in society that advance the agenda that you want to pursue, and they are changes which would not be justified without the manufactured problem. So once they then started saying we need a war on terror and we need to invade Afghanistan and all this stuff, well, it was blatantly obvious that this was a problem, reaction, solution, and that it wasn't done by 19 Islamic hijackers. I mean, I'll give you one example, and this is just one of incredible numbers of examples of the ludicrous nature of the official story. One of the hijackers was supposed to be, still listed as such today, was called Hani Hanjour. Hani Hanjour was supposed to have been the pilot of Flight 77, which is supposed to have struck the Pentagon, but actually didn't. People will see that when they read the book. And one of the amazing things that Flight 77 with Hani Hanjour at the controls was supposed to have done was to come over past the Pentagon and then done a massive, incredible descending spiral to hit the Pentagon. And somehow manage, it was brilliant really, to hit the one part of the Pentagon called Wedge 1 that had just undergone reinforcement to protect against the very kind of attack that was supposed to have happened on 9/11. On the other side of the Pentagon at the same time were all the bigwigs and Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, all those people. But no, this incredibly professional group of Islamic terrorists somehow managed to hit the other side of the building as far away from those people as you could get. And to do that required this incredible spiral descent, which, as I quote in the book, pilots who actually have flown those planes, some of whom have flown the actual planes that were hijacked on 9/11, who said they couldn't have done what this guy, Hani Hanjour, did. Amazing, really. What's even more amazing is that 6 weeks before 9/11, Hani Hanjour was refused the right to hire a one-engine plane because of his incompetence and dangerous nature as a pilot. He was absolutely so useless that they banned him from hiring 6 weeks before a one-engine plane. Another instructor who went up with him at one point refused to go up with him a second time because he was so dangerous and useless. And this is the man still today who is named as the pilot of Flight 77, doing all those things that pilots that flew those planes say they couldn't do. And in the 9/11 Commission report, which, as I expose massively in the book, was simply set up to parrot the official story and shut out all evidence that challenged it.
And one thing, David, give people a laugh and remind them who they put in charge of that.
Well, I'll come to that in a second.
Go on then.
What I was going to say is the 9/11 Commission report said that Hani Hanjour was the most effective, to put it another way, he was the best pilot of the 4 on 9/11. So imagine, therefore, how bad the others must have bloody been when you look at his background. The 9/11 Commission was set up to parrot the official story. In fact, if you go back a step, in fact 2 steps, Bush and Cheney fought tenaciously not to have an investigation at all. into attacks on American soil involving the death of nearly 3,000 people. And that devastation, that catastrophe, they fought not to have an official investigation. Now, why would you do that unless you were in fear of what it might, if it was genuinely independent, might show? In fact, the trigger is the 9/11 Commission that should have been,
right,
but wasn't.
Right.
When eventually public pressure and questions like, you don't want an investigation into 9/11? Surely it should be the most painstaking, detailed investigation in American history. So they had to start to give. And they gave by appointing as head of the commission Henry Kissinger.
Wow.
Henry Kissinger has been an insider of this death cult that I'm exposing in the trigger as being behind 9/11 for virtually the entirety of his adult life, at least. And of course, that was so obviously not credible. And when people started demanding that Kissinger name his clients in his notorious organization called Kissinger Associates, and as I've said in the book, if he'd have named his clients, it wouldn't have just taken the lid off. It would have flown it to Mars, because of the people that he actually represents privately. So instead of revealing that, Kissinger stood down. And then they put a guy in charge as chairman called Thomas Keane, who later said that the commission was set up to fail, which is true, but he was chairman, so why did he let it? But the key person was Philip Zelikow. Philip Zelikow was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. He decided who was interviewed, what evidence went in the report and what didn't, and he ran the whole show, including writing the final report, in which he left out everything that challenged the official story. Even amazing pieces of evidence that were put forward never got in the final report. And Philip Zelikow was a big-time Bush administration insider. He actually wrote a book with the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and he also wrote reports about the need for dealing with terrorism and warning about terrorism, including warning in one of his missives about a terrorist attack involving the World Trade Center before 9/11 happened. And Philip Zelikow, which when people get towards the end of the book and I start really getting into who actually did it, was also and is also an ultra-Zionist extremist. And what you find as the book unfolds later on is the number of ultra-Zionists that were in positions of power, crucial to making 9/11 happen and then to covering it up, and making it a non-investigation, is absolutely staggering. When you, I've got 3 chapters at the end, just a coincidence ? And then just a coincidence 2 and just a coincidence 3. It's extraordinary. I mean, for instance, how many people know that in 2001, 200 Israelis were arrested and questioned in America over being involved in an Israeli spy ring. 140 were arrested before 9/11 and 60 afterwards. And they were operating a spy ring all across America. But the focal point of this spy ring was Florida. And in particular, a place in Florida, not far from Miami, called Hollywood. Hollywood just happened to be one of the key centers of the so-called Islamic hijackers blamed for 9/11. Some of them lived in the same street as some of these people in this Israeli spy ring. What happened to them? Well, the man who was leading the criminal investigation into 9/11 was a man called Michael Chertoff. Michael Chertoff is an ultra Zionist who was appointed head of the criminal division of the Justice Department in 2001 and oversaw the whole criminal investigation, along with Robert Mueller, the director of the FBI, that led an absolute non-investigation. And Robert Mueller was appointed head of the FBI 2 weeks before 9/11. So this guy, Chertoff, who would not only head that criminal investigation, but also wrote the Patriot Act, which took away and deleted so many freedoms in America, justified by 9/11. He wrote that, the Patriot Act. He also went on to be head of Homeland Security, in which he then implemented what he'd written in the Patriot Act. Well, this guy, Chertoff, he let those people being questioned about the spy ring, he let them go. And they went back to Israel. How many people know that on the morning of 9/11, while the first tower, the North Tower, was burning, second one hadn't been hit yet, that a lady was looking out of her window at an apartment building, looking across the river to the burning tower. And she saw 5 people of Middle Eastern appearance, 5 men, who were filming the tower. They were with a white van. They were whooping and cheering and high-fiving while the tower burned. And she called the police, and eventually the police and then the FBI picked them up. And they turned out to be, yes, of Middle Eastern appearance because they were Israelis. And 2 of those 5 were known to the FBI as Mossad agents, the Israeli intelligence operation. And they were kept for 71 days in custody, being questioned. They failed lie detector tests. And then Michael Chertoff, ultra-Zionist, let them go back to Israel. One of the sixth person, guy called Dominic Suter, was the owner, the runner of a company called Urban Moving Systems, where these 5 dancing Israelis worked. And he was questioned by the FBI over what the heck was going on. And they said, we're going to come back for a second interview. Well, they didn't, because after the first one, he's on a plane to Israel. And they were taking pictures of themselves while the tower was burning. And some residents said that actually they were there before the first tower was hit. This lady saw them just after it was hit, but the others say they were there before the tower was hit. And there is supporting evidence of this, because in the postscript at the end of the trigger, I had updated information that's happened. And a Freedom of Information Act request was made to be given these pictures that obviously were then taken by the FBI at the time, of what these dancing Israelis were actually taking pictures of themselves. And they didn't produce the real pictures. They produced photocopied versions of them. But the building background, that which was left in the photocopy, supported and confirmed that they were where that woman said they were. All of the pictures were dated September the 11th, except one, involving one of these known Mossad agents. That picture was dated September the 10th. And this supports witness testimony that this man was seen around that apartment block with another man speaking, quote, a foreign language on September the 10th. And despite that, they were let go back to Israel. And the prior knowledge of what was going to happen was blatantly obvious. And when you look at the whole story of 9/11, Israel, Mossad, Israeli military, the Israel Defense Forces, etc., are just so obviously involved. These 200 people, Israelis, that were questioned over this spy ring, many of them were posing as art students, very non-convincingly to many people. And when they were arrested and questioned, many of them turned out to be experts in explosives, in computers, etc. All the things, as I explain in the book, were necessary to do 9/11. And they were either present or former, not that you're ever former, members of the Israeli Defense Forces that had specialized in their service in things like explosives and computers, etc., as I say, and many other skills that were vital to pull off 9/11. And what we've had over the years is this fear of being called anti-Semitic that has stopped this coming out. Some people have tried in a more low-profile way, but it's the fear that most people have, oh, we can't go there. So they talk about an inside job. Well, it was, but it wasn't just an inside job of people in America, although absolutely they were involved as well. It was the work of a cult. And in the second half of the book, I tell the history of this cult in some detail. And I'll briefly explain now just the headlines, the bullet points. This manipulation of the world goes back thousands of years, but you can pick up the element of it that's very, very relevant to what is happening today, or that's happening with technology and the smart grid. You can pick that element of it up. And that which was behind 9/11, you can pick it up in the 17th century. And a man called Sabbatai Zevi, he was a Sephardic Jewish guy, but he weren't really. He hated Jews, and so did the cult, and so does the cult that was formed in his name. Zevi claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, and he started this cult, which was then called Sabbateanism, and basically what they did was invert the Jewish belief system. So if in conventional Judaism a certain day was a fast day, then in Sabbateanism it would be a feast day. And that's kind of, okay, that's quite mild, that's all right. But this inversion then takes us into some very, very dark areas, and areas that explain what is happening today, explain the Epsteins and the Savills, for instance. Because if it was a taboo to have sex with children, then under the inversion law of Sabbateanism, then it was not only not taboo, it was to be encouraged. And was part of what you had to do, because this was the sales pitch that they sold to these followers. And he had about 1 million followers in the end, according to Jewish sources. And by the way, what I'm saying in this description here, these historical bullet points, they're all from Jewish sources, all of them. Because some people in the Jewish community know what I'm saying is true. Most of them don't. They've been hoodwinked. So this Sabbateanism got about 1 million followers, and we're talking in the 17th century. I mean, that is a massive, massive part of what was then the Jewish community that were following this alleged Messiah. In the end, he was operating in the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire, and he was in Turkey. And the Sultan, head of the Ottoman Empire of the time, gave him a choice. You can convert to Islam, or you ain't going to be around very long. And of course, he didn't have to consider it very long, and he decided to convert. Many of his followers decided to convert, but converting in public only. They lived outwardly as Muslims and practiced Sabbateanism, which is another word for Satanism. It's a death cult involving incest and all the things that, you know, I've been putting out for years and years about this elite today. That you can chart them back even further than this, but you can absolutely chart them back to the formation of this Sabbateanism. And their technique, their big modus operandi, was infiltration, posing as outwardly a Roman Catholic, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever, but actually being a Sabbatean in private, pushing the Sabbatean agenda. And like I say, the sales pitch for the followers was, you have to do as much evil as possible, because the more evil you do, the quicker God will come and sort the world out. I know it's ludicrous, but that was the sales pitch. Of course, they didn't believe it, but they just wanted the followers to believe it. And it got the term Sabbateanism of redemption through sin. That was the line. Wow. Be redeemed by being as evil as possible. This was the way it worked. Then in the 18th century, the next century, along came a guy called Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was another Sephardic Jew, but wasn't. He was a Sabbatean. And he claimed to be a reincarnation of Zabbatai Zevi and a reincarnation of the biblical patriarch Jacob. And he took Sabbateanism into still new depths of depravity. Jewish historians have described Jacob Frank, in terms of one of the most evil people that the Jewish community has ever seen. And he really focused on infiltrating the Roman Catholic Church. He converted lots and lots of apparently Jewish people, actually Sabbateans, who hate Jews, by the way, into the Roman Catholic Church. And in the 18th century, he got together with a guy called Mayer Amstel Rothschild in Germany. Mayer Amstel Rothschild was the founder of the Rothschild dynasty. The Rothschild family up to him was called Bauer. It was a Middle Ages occult family, Bauer. And he changed the name to Rothschild, which means red shield in German. And it was the Rothschild name came from the red shield, the Star of David, on their house in Frankfurt. And Frank and Rothschild got together with another guy, another Jewish guy, who had converted to Roman Catholicism and was brought up or educated as a Jesuit, classic Sabbateanism modus operandi, and his name was Adam Weishaupt. And Adam Weishaupt is infamously in this, alternative arena, the guy who officially fronted up the creation of the Illuminati. And the Bible, or one of the Bibles, of Sabbatean Frankism, as it became known after Frank came on the scene, is the Kabbalah, the mystical, esoteric books of Jewish belief. And the book in the Kabbalah that they most focus on is called the Zohar. And the Zohar, the word means radiance or illuminated, and hence Illuminati. And through the Illuminati and other parts of this Sabbatean Frankist cult, they expanded across the world to now be in country after country after country dictating events. Now, when they had the conversion, the fake conversion in the Ottoman Empire at the time of Sabbatai Zevi, those that converted became known as Donma or Donme. And that's a word meaning to turn, to convert. And these Donma come through history and infiltrated Islam and got key positions in Islam, posing as Muslims. And eventually, they manifested as the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud. The House of Saud are Sabbateans, Sabbatean Frankists. And the British Empire and the House of Saud were brought together with a guy, or brought in a guy called Wahab, who was a Sabbatean, a Donma. And his daughter married into the House of Saud, and from Wahab came Wahhabism, which is the extreme form of Islam, or allegedly so, that rules the roost where? In Saudi Arabia, under the Sabbatean Frankist Donma Saudi royal family. And it's also, of course, the head chopping, hand chopping ISIS Islamic State. Another wing of this Sabbatean Frankist death cult was behind the creation of Israel. And they've been running Israel ever since. Doesn't matter if it's the right or left of Israeli politics. It's all the bloody same. It's all controlled by Sabbateans. So whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu or someone else, the Sabbateans are still in power. And in a chapter in the book I call Atlantic Crossing, I show how the Sabbateans moved in on America and have taken over control of America. They also control Silicon Valley today. And so you have a situation where this Sabbatean Frankist death cult, this inversion of Judaism, which hates Jews, it shows how not only do they control what they do by control and ownership of the media and of Silicon Valley, increasingly the place where most people get their information from, and in the light of this hysterical censorship that's going on now out of Silicon Valley, they control what they're doing, and they're also controlling or suppressing the exposure of what they're doing. So if you start exposing this stuff, then they start suppressing your information, and in the end even banning you from talking about it. And this is where we are. And I show in the book that Sabbatean Frankism, the cult, was the driving force, the organizing force behind 9/11. And 9/11 was, of course, the trigger, hence the name of the book, for a stream of events that were justified in its wake, leading up right up to present day. Just before I finish this answer, Jason, let me just give you a sequence.
Thanks, David.
And remember, when I'm talking about Jewish here, I'm talking not about mainstream Jewish people. I'm talking about fake Jewish people called Sabbatean Frankists.
Brilliant.
In 1979, the so-called father of Israeli intelligence, a man called Issa Harel, was interviewed by an American journalist, and he predicted that there would be an Arab terrorist attack on New York's biggest building. He said they would do this because symbolically it was a phallic symbol, and by targeting that, it would break the spirit of America, in effect. In the same year, 1979, Benjamin Netanyahu started organizing conferences calling for a war on terror. First one was in Jerusalem, and in 1984 he had another one in America. All the American leadership were attending, including Father George Bush. And he wrote a book, Netanyahu, calling for a war on terror. And also these conferences and this book was calling for a change whereby countries would be subject to preemptive strikes if those making the preemptive strike decided that they were planning terrorism. And then in 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu became Prime Minister of Israel and ordered a report. It was called the Strategy for Securing the Realm. The short name for it was the Clean Break. And it was overseen by a man called Richard Pearl.
Oh, him, yeah.
Yeah, and an ultra Zionist extremist. And in that, he called, in the Clean Break, for the removal of Saddam Hussein from Iraq and for destabilizing Syria and causing as much inter-Arab conflict as possible, all of which would suit the ambitions of Israel, i.e. the Sabbatean Frankists that control Israel. In 1997, a year after that, Richard Pearl in America and a stream of other ultra-Zionists created an organization called the Project for the New American Century. The co-founders were ultra-Zionist extremists called William Crystal and Robert Kagan. And in the Project for the New American Century, among many others of relevance, were the following. Dick Cheney, who would at 9/11 be the de facto president of the United States, with Boy Bush as just the figurehead, and was vice president officially. Also in the Project for the New American Century was Donald Rumsfeld, who would be defense secretary, running the Pentagon at the time of 9/11. Paul Wolfowitz, his ultra-Zionist deputy secretary of defense, would also be there at 9/11. And a guy called Dov Zakheim, ultra-Zionist, who would, at the time of 9/11, be comptroller of the Pentagon, controlling the entire Pentagon budget. And other people in there included someone who's still around, called John Bolton, who left as National Security Advisor in the last few days of the Trump administration. And in 1998, the year after that organization was created, they wrote to the then President Bill Clinton, urging him to invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein. We move forward to the year 2000, actually September 2000, a year to the month before 9/11. And this Project for the New American Century then published a document calling for American forces to fight and decisively win multiple theater wars in the Middle East and elsewhere to create a series of regime changes. And those countries were Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, North Korea, leading to regime change, it said, in China. And they said in this document that this process of transformation, as they described it, i.e. all these regime changes and massive increases in military spending in America to fight these wars, that transformation would be necessarily slow, and here's the quote from the document, absent some catalyzing and catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. These people that wrote that document came to power with Bush in January 2001. And 9 months later, America had what Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. As a result of that trigger, 9/11, for which the official story is beyond belief pathetic in terms of its credibility, they started picking off the countries on the list. And after the towers were hit, within an hour or so, a man called Ehud Barak, who had been Prime Minister of Israel up to the early months of 2001 and was a former head of military intelligence, he was on the BBC saying that, or indicating that, Osama bin Laden was behind it. Everyone else is running around saying, what's happening, what's happening? No, Osama bin Laden's behind it, and pushing for an invasion of Afghanistan, which of course came very soon afterwards. The New York Times reported just after 9/11 that on September the 19th and 20th, the same people met under the guise of the Defense Policy Board of the Pentagon and plotted the removal of Saddam Hussein from Iraq. This is immediately after 9/11. Which brings me to General Wesley Clark. He was interviewed in 2007 on a alternative television show in America called Democracy Now! And he told the story of what happened to him immediately after 9/11. He said he went to the Pentagon. I mean, Wesley Clark was, you know, a top man in the military in NATO, very well-known general in America, and you know, he should be subject to war crimes as well for what he did in the Balkans. But anyway, another story. He told Democracy Now! That immediately after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon, he met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, the Secretary of Defense and Deputy, and then he went downstairs and he met a friend of his in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are the uniform level controllers of the Pentagon, although they're down the hierarchy of the real hierarchy, which is the Sabatier and Frankist hierarchy. They won't even know there is a Sabatier and Frankist hierarchy, some of them anyway. This friend of his, this general, said to Wesley Clark, we're going to invade Iraq. This is days after 9/11. And Clark said, I said, well, have they connected Saddam Hussein to 9/11 then? Oh, no, nothing like that. But it's come from upstairs, we're going to invade Iraq. So Clark goes away, he says, comes back a few weeks later, by which time America is in Afghanistan. And he met the same general. And he said, I thought we were going to invade Iraq. Well, what's happened? He said, oh, it's worse than that, sir. He said, we just had this from upstairs, Rumsfeld's office. And he pulled up this piece of paper. And he said, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And he listed the countries. They were the countries listed by the Project for the New American Century, this ultra-Zionist organization operating, controlled out of Israel, Sabbatean and Frankist Israel, a year before 9/11. And so, from then, they start picking off these countries. Bush and Blair lied about weapons of mass destruction to tick off Iraq. They lied because there wasn't a credible reason to invade Iraq, so they made one up. They go away, Republican and Labour Party, and in comes Democrat and Conservative Party, Barack Obama and David Cameron. They get rid of Gaddafi along with NATO, another one gone. They also start, I say they were fronting for it, these Sabbatean Frankists were doing it through their various channels. They then create the catastrophe in Syria, another massive Sabbatean Frankist target. And without Russia coming in with air support, then they'd have been they'd have got rid of Assad in Syria a very long time ago. And then they go aside, and in comes the maverick Trump. It's going to drain the swamp. Who then starts targeting Iran, and starts targeting China, of course, as well, which was on the list for regime change in this project, The New American Century. And then I won't go into them now because they're all in the book. But when you then see the major players before, during, and after 9/11, in terms of the cover-up afterwards, and you find they're dominated by ultra-Zionists. And just to put that into context, the Jewish population of the world, a lot of people will be stunned by this, the Jewish population of the world is 0.2%. Depending on how you define what a Jewish person is, there are different definitions. The mean figure between them is about 16 million. 16 million Jewish people in a world of 7.7 billion. There's only 2% of the population of America is Jewish, and that's, along with Israel, by far the biggest, massively by far, the biggest Jewish populations in the world. And the people that I'm talking about, these we hate Jews but will pose as them, Sabbatean Frankist cult, is a tiny, tiny fraction of that 0.2% at 16 million. And yet, the ratio of such people in those positions of power before, during, and after 9/11 is utterly, utterly staggering. They covered every base to make sure it happened and that the truth of what happened didn't come out. And I've gone for this big time in The Trigger because, as we discussed earlier, we've got to put aside consequences. And we just got to tell the bloody truth and let the truth do its work. Because it's intimidation, fierce intimidation, that is stopping this coming out.
Ooh, bloody hell, David. Yeah, and the truth will set you free, as you said. Thank you so much for all that. This is why you see Dave. We've only got an hour or just over an hour with David, and it's nearly up. So David can't explain everything in an hour. That's why David's presentations last a day. The Trigger, there it is. You've got to get that book. And you know, just a quick thing, David, this is not all about 9/11, as you can all see. This is a history lesson from a very learned gentleman who's done his history qualification and work, you know. Finally, more and more people know now, thank goodness, for people, because of people like David Icke. But I think I know quite a bit about it, David, but I know nothing in comparison to what you're talking about here. And, you know, finally more people know, and I just wonder, you know, what is going to happen, because people are, it's like the more people know about it, obviously the solution to any dissent and any truth coming out is ultimately, well, you either kill everybody, or which they, by the way, would have done. This regime, let me remind people, are so brutal, cruel, unscrupulous and unethical. It wasn't that long ago, in other centuries, or in this century, where you just have your head chopped off for even daring to say this type of thing, or pointing a finger at Dracula in the shadows. It's harder to do that now. Go on, David, go on. Sorry.
I would say, picking up the point you just made, this the theme, the backbone of The Trigger is 9/11. The official story is a nonsense, and who really did it. But it's not all about 9/11. Right. The people that did 9/11 are behind Silicon Valley. They're behind the smart grid. They're behind connecting the human brain to AI. They're behind 5G. They're behind control of the banking system and all these different aspects. They own the pharmaceutical cartel. They own the biotech cartel. They own the oil cartel. They own the media cartel. So the book demolishes the official story of 9/11, reveals who really did it and why, but also puts it massively in the context of the here and now, and explains events in the here and now from that perspective that give clarity to what appear to be random what's going on situations. They're not random. And you can see very clearly what's going on as long as the right dots are connected.
Yeah. Well, thanks, David, for saying that. And also, you can see what's coming. That's what your work is. You're like a bit like like Gerald Celente, a bit with the trends forecasting for money. You're showing people what's going to happen should we stay on this trajectory without any resistance, you know. And I've been what an amazing smokescreen, the anti-Semitic thing. I've been called anti-Semitic. I've had Juliet Atzman on the show. I've had you and lots of other people. You know, we're not anti-Semitics. We're anti anything that's terrible for humanity, and we're anti-evil, actually. But this smokescreen of the Semitic thing has stopped anyone talking about anything. So I'm glad you discussed what you discussed there and explained to people, David, about what the background of that is. It's very important for people to understand. Go on, David, sorry.
That's very, very important, this point.
Yeah. Very
important. And I go into it in the book, and people are going to be staggered when they read it.
Oh, God. Shocked.
When they read this part alone, they'll be staggered. But briefly again, I call this whole anti-Semitic hysteria the anti-Semitism industry and the protection racket. And it is a protection racket. And it's not a protection racket to protect genuinely Jewish people from discrimination. I'm all for that. I don't want discrimination against anybody. It's a protection racket to protect the far-right Sabbatean Frankist government, whatever left or right, in Israel, and the Sabbatean Frankist cult in general, from public exposure and questioning. And therefore, what they're doing is constantly expanding the definition of anti-Semitism, which is a misnomer anyway. That Semitic refers to a group of languages in the Middle East, the overwhelming vast majority of which are Arab languages. Anti-Semitism really means anti-Arab, bizarrely. But anyway, that aside, they are expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include more and more of what they're doing. So this new definition of anti-Semitism, which governments and the British Labour Party and so many others are adopting, it's scandalous. It's equating criticism of Israel and Zionism, which is a government and a political philosophy, with anti-Semitism. That's why they've created this new definition, which the Labour Party, with its backbone turning to jelly, outrageously adopted. And as a result of which, Jewish people in the Labour Party, some of which have served in the Israeli Defense Forces, are being expelled from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. I mean, you could not bloody make it up. But the Labour Party could make anything up these days. It's not next to useless, it is useless, and it showed itself to be so in the way it has capitulated to this anti-Semitism protection racket. And you'll note now that all you have to do is to talk about a global conspiracy. You don't mention anybody involved in it at all. You just talk about a global conspiracy. And immediately you're called anti-Semitic, because talking about a global conspiracy is an, quote, anti-Semitic trope where Jews are blamed for conspiring to control the world. Well, I'm not saying that. Protection racket, death cult. I'm saying you're doing it. And that at its core, certainly at the death cult level, you're not Jewish. You're Sabbatean Frankist. You are Satanists, part of a death cult. And so I'm calling them out. Amazing. And they can throw all the abuse they like at me and I'll laugh in the face. I couldn't care less. Well past all that. I want the truth out. And like I say, what I've said in the book about 3 or 4 times at different points is no one needs to read this book more urgently than the Jewish community of the world to see how monumentally they've been shafted by this Sabbatean Frankist cult. And it's not something that stopped with 9/11. It's been going on ever since. And it is fundamental to where the world is now going in terms of control by AI and by technology.
Brilliant, David. Brilliant, David. Just before we go, because I know we've got to go now in a minute, but, also, I want to make it very clear to people. Let's get it straight. It couldn't have been a fire. Okay, those planes could not bring down that building. It's been proved now. There was, I forgot the report, investigation just come out, hasn't it? I forgot who they were called now. Who were they, David?
What happened, just very quickly, is when I wrote my first book on 9/11, which came out in September 2002, I pointed out that the third building that fell on 9/11, a lot of people don't even realize there was more than two, called Building 7, which was owned by Larry Silverstein before he bought the lease on the Twin Towers weeks before 9/11, vastly increased the insurance in the case of a terrorist attack.
Made a fortune, didn't he?
Yep. Personal $14 million investment in buying the lease, he was paid out by insurance companies to the tune of $4.5 billion. He owned Building 7, 47-story steel-framed building, and it fell at 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11, having not been hit by an aircraft. And it was is the most. Just go onto YouTube and put in Building 7 collapse 9/11, and you will see the most blatant controlled demolition you'll ever see. Where you see from time to time on the news, you see stadiums and skyscrapers coming down in a controlled demolition, where they put the charges in exactly the right place that stop the building toppling over and hitting other buildings, and it comes down on its own footprint. And there's usually lots and lots of dust involved when they do it. And the architects and engineers that I've quoted in the book have said that was a controlled demolition. There was one guy, he was a controlled demolition expert in the Netherlands, who didn't know that there'd been a third building on 9/11. Like I say, many people don't, still now. And he was approached by a film company to ask him, they wanted to show him Building 7, which he didn't know was anything to do with 9/11. So they showed him Building 7 coming down, and they said, in your expert opinion as a professional demolisher, what brought that building down, do you think? He said, well, the controlled demolition, obvious. That was Building 7. And in a retrospective documentary on 9/11 on public service broadcasting in America, Larry Silverstein was asked what happened, what he did that day. And he talked about Building 7. And he said that the fire commander came to him that afternoon and said that they were losing control of the fire. Well, actually, the truth is the fire was out before the building came down. Nothing to do with fire. And as another, by the way, the official story of Building 7, the official government explanation is that this 47-story steel frame building came down because of an office furnishings fire. That's the official report, staggering as it may be, making it the only steel frame building in the entirety of building architectural engineering history, before or since, that's ever fallen because of fire at all, never mind an office furnishings fire. Anyway, Silverstein said in this interview, I quote him word for word in the book, that this fire commander came to him. The fire commander, by the way, has never ever come forward and said, yes, it was me. Mystery man. He made it up. And he said, the commander said to me, we're losing control of the fire, basically. And Silverstein said, well, we agreed that there'd been such a loss of life that day that we'd pull the building. We'd pull it. And he said, and shortly afterwards, basically, we watched the building fall.
And let's get my 3 billion.
Well, of course, first of all, fire officers and fire departments do not pull buildings. Demolition experts do. And secondly, it takes weeks to put the charges in the right places in a 47-story building to bring it down on its own footprint. Of course, we talked earlier about the 9/11 Commission. Well, the 9/11 Commission's got a big problem with Building 7 because they can't really put in an official report that it was an office furnishings fire. They'd get slaughtered because most people, it was put out at a press conference and it kind of went out, but not very far. Most people do not even know that Building 7 fell, let alone that they've explained it away as an office furnishings fire. So they had a problem with this report because you cannot explain the fall of Building 7 in any other way but a controlled demolition. So what did they do? They didn't bloody mention it. In the 9/11 official commission report, 3 buildings fell that day, and they don't even mention one of them. Why? Because they can't explain it without it being a controlled demolition, obviously. This is what you're dealing with. And 9/11 is absolutely awash with these stories of impossibility and lies. And like I say, it's 2 books, and it's highly detailed in terms of facts and documented. And no one will read that book and not come away unless they are deceiving themselves and come away with two obvious facts from it. One, the official story of 9/11 is ludicrous. And 2, there is no way in the world that the involvement of so many ultra-Zionists from a tiny population can be explained away without accepting that Israel, brackets, Sabbatean Frankism, from my point of view, was involved fundamentally, centrally, in the events of 9/11.
And how about Grenfell Towers? That didn't collapse into its own footprint. That was absolutely burnt through, wasn't it, David?
Well, there was a classic example of a building in Madrid that was a steel-framed skyscraper, and it burnt fiercely for 24 hours and didn't collapse.
Wow.
No steel-framed building has ever collapsed because of fire, brackets, except on 9/11, which of course they didn't, but that's the official story.
Wow, man, wow. Oh, God, David, we've gone over time. I know you're a busy guy. We've got to go. So just to show David's book again, I'm not going to rant on you as I usually do. The Trigger, The Lie That Changed the World, Who Really Did It and Why. A great history lesson from David. And let me just say it once again, David. This is the 9/11 Commission that didn't happen. This is the 9/11 Commission, right? So, David, thank you so much for what you've been doing. And as I'll just end by saying about Gurdjieff, he said, you can't escape prison unless you see it, right? So, David helps us to understand the prison that we are in, which you could easily believe was freedom, and the nuances of it and how it works, who's running it, who started it, where it's going. This is the key to escaping it, because if you don't see that, we've got no chance. David, thank you so much for your fantastic work. And
pleasure, Jason.
Thank you for being you, David. I'm not joking. You're an iconic figure in this world, and that is a piece of history, unbelievable. And thank you for everything, and thank you for supporting me as well.
Real pleasure. All the best. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, David.